You ever hear a story that sounds small at first, almost boring, and then by the end it completely changes how you look at an entire species? Yeah, this is one of those, so before we begin, make sure you're subscribed to Coming the HFY because stories like this don't come around often, and trust me, you're going to want to hear this one all the way through. The last thing Rolan packed before leaving for Earth was not advanced equipment, not emergency rations, not even the translation implant backup kit he had been advised to carry. It was a simple, worn notebook, the kind you'd expect from a student who still believed the universe could be understood if you just wrote enough things down, and his mother, Thera, stood in the doorway watching him prepare with the calm certainty of someone who had read the official briefing and trusted it far more than she should have. Category 2 planet, she said, glancing at the holographic pamphlet. Low hostility rating, dominant species classified as socially cooperative, moderate intelligence, minimal environmental risk outside isolated anomalies. And then she paused, tilting her head slightly as she read the final line. Primary cultural hazard, excessive engagement in something called small talk. And Rolan had nodded, because he had read the same 3-page document, and like every other top candidate selected for the Galactic Cultural Exchange Program, he believed he understood what he was getting into, which, in hindsight, was the first mistake. The program itself was ancient by interstellar standards. Send one young researcher to live among another species for 3 months, observe, record, return, publish, and for centuries it had produced predictable results. Mild fascination, minor discomfort, occasionally digestive complications, but never anything significant. Nothing that changed a participant in a way that required reevaluation of entire planetary classifications, and certainly nothing that forced multiple interstellar committees into emergency sessions. Rolan was 23, top of his class in adaptive biology, psychologically stable, methodical, patient, the kind of student instructors used as an example. And when the coordinator, Jarek, shook his hand before departure, he said the same thing he always said, "You'll be fine. Rural zone. Low population density. Ideal conditions." Rolan believed him. He really did. He landed in a place called Nebraska on a quiet afternoon, and the first thing that greeted him wasn't a human. It was a mosquito, small, insignificant, entirely unremarkable, and yet it bit him twice in rapid succession as if testing the limits of his existence, and Rolan stared at it, blinking slowly, before writing his very first note. Day 1. Local fauna displays aggressive persistence disproportionate to size, and that should have been his second warning, but he didn't recognize it yet. His host family lived on the edge of a wide open field that stretched farther than his species typically preferred to see in any direction, and their names were Mark and Elena Carter, with a son named Noah who asked questions like he was being graded on how many he could fit into a single breath, and when Noah asked, "Are you from Europe?" Rolan said yes, because the briefing said yes was the correct answer, and when Noah followed up with, "You don't look like Europe," Rolan asked what Europe looked like, and Noah shrugged and said, "I dunno, more tired?" Which Rolan wrote down immediately because it felt important even if he didn't understand why. The house was small, comfortable, and contained a creature called a dog named Rusty who snored so loudly that Rolan initially assumed structural instability in the building before realizing it was intentional, and strangely enough, he liked it. He liked all of it. The quiet mornings, the endless sky, the way humans spoke even when silence would have been more efficient, and his early reports reflected that. Describing humans as noisy but tolerable, their food as unnecessarily saturated with butter, and their pets as dominant through acoustic intimidation, and everything seemed exactly as expected until week 2, when Mark took him to a grocery store and Rolan experienced what he would later describe as the first true fracture in his understanding of human civilization, because the building was enormous, filled with thousands upon thousands of items, many of which were nearly identical, and he stood in front of an aisle of bread, 20 different kinds, then 30, then more, and he couldn't move. Not because he was overwhelmed, but because he couldn't understand why such a system existed at all, and when Mark casually said, "This isn't even the big store," something inside Rolan shifted in a way he couldn't yet define. By week 3, he attended something called a barbecue, where humans gathered around controlled fire not to survive but to celebrate, slowly cooking food for hours as if time itself was an ingredient, and when he tasted smoked meat for the first time, he wrote only one line that night. They invest time into flavor like it matters, and that was the moment curiosity turned into something deeper. By week 4, his reports became longer, less structured, filled with observations that didn't fit into scientific categories. People cheering for oversized vegetables, strangers congratulating each other with genuine emotion, entire communities bonding over events that had no measurable survival value. And he began to notice something unsettling. Humans did things that made no logical sense. And yet those things seemed to matter more than the logical ones. Around week 6, he stopped trying to categorize and started simply watching, and that's when it really began to change him. He saw a father adjust his position so his sleeping child wouldn't wake, without interrupting his conversation, without drawing attention, just quietly adapting, and he saw strangers help each other in waiting rooms without expectation, offering comfort in small, almost invisible ways. And none of it was organized, none of it was required, it just happened, like a background process running constantly beneath everything else. And Rolan realized something that no report had ever prepared him for. Humans weren't defined by what they were, but by what they kept doing, over and over, regardless of whether it made sense. His final letter home didn't read like science anymore. It read like someone trying to explain a feeling using the wrong language. He described Earth as a hostile world, full of dangers both large and microscopic, a place where survival should be difficult, where evolution had not provided sufficient advantages, where fragility should have been a limiting factor, and yet humans had built civilizations, traditions, relationships, systems of meaning that extended far beyond survival. And the conclusion he reached was simple but deeply unsettling. Humans are dangerous not because of their strength, but because they refuse to stop. When he returned, his report was not accepted as standard documentation. It was debated, challenged, reviewed repeatedly until eventually, reluctantly, the classification of Earth was changed, not because of its environment, but because of its inhabitants, because a species that continues forward despite everything, pain, fear, uncertainty, even logic, is not predictable. And anything unpredictable at that scale becomes, by definition, dangerous. Years later, when asked if he would go back, Rolan didn't hesitate long before answering, yes, and then after a moment added, but next time, I'd bring more pages. Because some things can't be understood in 3 months, and some worlds aren't dangerous because they attack you, but because they change you without asking permission, and by the time you realize it, it's already too late.